There is something deeply unsettling about the truth that everything you've ever seen about our solar system is wrong. Not in detail, but in feeling. Because the moment you truly understand the scale of our solar system, something shifts inside you. The planets stop feeling like neighbors and start feeling impossibly alone. Most diagrams show a neat, comforting picture. Worlds lined up, almost touching, orbiting peacefully around a glowing center. But those images hide a reality so vast that if it were drawn accurately, it would barely fit across entire cities. And most of it would be completely empty. And that raises a quiet, haunting question. Why is there so much nothing? On Velarin's Sleepy Space Mysteries, we've explored ideas like the silent expansion of the universe, and how even galaxies drift through enormous voids. But tonight, we bring that same unsettling perspective closer into our own cosmic home. Because the emptiness doesn't start out there. It starts right here, in our solar system. As we gently move through this journey together, you'll begin to see distances not as numbers, but as silence, as isolation, as vast stretches where nothing happens for millions of kilometers. And by the end, you may begin to feel something strange. Not fear exactly, but a quiet awareness of just how much space surrounds us. If you enjoy these slow cosmic explorations, consider subscribing, leaving a like, and turning on the bell so you don't miss future journeys. You can also join as a member to support the channel. And before we drift further, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's begin with something familiar and slowly make it feel unimaginable. Now let's begin with something that feels familiar, something that seems close, something you've looked at countless times without ever questioning its true distance. The space between Earth and the Moon doesn't feel like much, does it? The Moon hangs in our sky, large and bright, sometimes so vivid it almost feels within reach. Ancient civilizations built stories around it. Modern humans walked on it. It feels like our closest companion in the universe. But what if I told you that even here, in the closest relationship Earth has with anything beyond itself, there is already an overwhelming amount of emptiness? The average distance between Earth and the Moon is about 384,000 kilometers. That number is easy to hear, but very difficult to feel. So instead, let's slow it down. Imagine Earth shrinking, becoming something small enough to hold in your hand. Not a planet anymore, but a sphere the size of a marble. Now place it gently in front of you. Where would the Moon go? Most people instinctively place it nearby, a few centimeters away, maybe a meter at most, something that still feels connected. But if you were to scale things correctly, the Moon would not sit beside it. You would have to walk, and keep walking, and walking, until you were roughly 30 marble lengths away. Only then would you place the Moon. That quiet stretch between them is not filled with anything. No glowing dust, no hidden objects, no cosmic bridges, just space. Now here's where the feeling begins to shift, because that empty gap that already feels surprisingly large is actually big enough to fit every other planet in the solar system. All of them, side by side: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. Every world we know, compressed into a single line, could fit between Earth and the Moon with space to spare. Pause for a moment and let that settle. Everything you've ever imagined as far away, every planet you've seen in books or images, could fit into what we casually think of as a nearby distance. And yet, even that space is mostly nothing. This is the first quiet clue. The solar system is not a crowded place. It only appears that way because we are shown it that way. But in reality, distance dominates everything. And this is only the beginning, because if the space between Earth and the Moon already feels unexpectedly vast, what happens when we step just a little farther out? Let's move to the next familiar point: the distance between Earth and the Sun. Light, the fastest thing that exists, takes about 8 minutes to travel from the Sun to Earth. 8 minutes doesn't sound like much, but remember, nothing can move faster than light. So this is the absolute minimum time anything could possibly take to cross that distance. If you were somehow able to travel at the speed of a commercial airplane, that same journey would not take minutes. It would take months. If you drove a car, it would take over 100 years. Suddenly, that warm sunlight touching your skin begins to feel more distant, more delayed, more disconnected. And yet, even this enormous distance is still considered close in the solar system. Close, that word begins to lose meaning out here, because as we continue moving outward, the gaps don't just increase. They stretch, they widen, they become something your mind stops trying to measure and starts trying to ignore. But we won't ignore it. Not tonight, because the deeper we move into this scale, the more a pattern begins to reveal itself. Pattern of separation, of isolation, of worlds that are not neighbors, but distant wanderers, drifting through an ocean so empty that even light takes time to cross it. And this leads us gently into a question we'll carry with us through this journey. If everything is so far apart, why didn't it form closer together? Why is our solar system built like this, stretched across such enormous distances, with so much nothing in between? We won't answer that just yet. Instead, we'll let that question drift quietly in the background as we move a little farther outward. Because next, we're going to visit the inner planets. And what you'll notice is not how close they are, but how surprisingly alone each one feels. Let's continue outward, slowly, gently, carrying that quiet question with us. If the space between Earth and the Moon is already vast, then surely the planets, at least, must feel closer to each other. After all, when we see them in diagrams, they're arranged almost like stepping stones, one after another, a sequence, a system that feels structured, even compact. But that impression begins to dissolve the moment we look at the inner solar system with scale in mind. Let's begin with Mercury. It orbits closest to the Sun, tracing a path that, in images, seems tightly wrapped around that glowing center. It feels like a small step outward from the sun, almost brushing against it. But even Mercury, the innermost planet, is tens of millions of kilometers away. And between Mercury and the next planet, Venus, there is not a smooth, crowded transition. There is a gap, a wide, silent gap, one that stretches far beyond anything we instinctively imagine. Now move to Venus, often called Earth's twin because of its similar size. But in terms of distance, it is anything but a twin neighbor. When Earth and Venus are on opposite sides of the Sun, they are separated by hundreds of millions of kilometers. Even at their closest, the distance is still vast enough that Venus appears only as a bright point of light in our sky. Not a world, not a sphere, just a distant signal. And then, there is Earth, our reference point, our sense of center. From here, everything feels meaningful, measurable, connected. But that sense begins to unravel when we look outward toward Mars. Because Mars is not just the next planet. It is separated from Earth by a shifting gulf, one that changes as both planets move along their orbits. At their closest, the distance is tens of millions of kilometers. At their farthest, hundreds of millions. Imagine that. Two planets both orbiting the same star, and yet at times they are separated by distances so large that even our fastest spacecraft take many months just to cross it. And in between, nothing. No hidden worlds, no dense clusters, no cosmic highways, just space. Now let's pause here, because something subtle is happening. Up to this point, we've been moving planet by planet, as if following a path. But in reality, there is no path. There are only points separated by emptiness. And that emptiness is not evenly filled. Dominates even the region that many people imagine as crowded. The asteroid belt is not what it seems. You've probably seen it portrayed as a chaotic field of tumbling rocks, where spacecraft must carefully dodge obstacles at every moment. A dangerous region, dense with debris. But the truth is far quieter. The asteroid belt is mostly empty. The objects within it are so widely spaced that if you were traveling through it, you might not see a single asteroid with your own eyes unless you deliberately went looking for one. Millions of rocks, scattered across an enormous volume, creating the illusion of density, when in reality, it is just another layer of emptiness. And this is where the pattern becomes undeniable. From Mercury to Venus to Earth to Mars, and through the asteroid belt, the story is the same. Not crowding, not clustering, but separation, careful, consistent spacing, as if something long ago pushed these worlds apart and left them drifting in quiet isolation. Which brings us back, gently, to the question we introduced earlier. Why didn't the planets form closer together? Why is there so much distance, even in what we call the inner solar system? To begin answering that, we have to shift our perspective. Because up to now, we've been thinking in terms of distance alone. But distance is only part of the story. The other part is motion. Everything here is moving, constantly, silently, orbiting a central force that dominates everything. And the closer a planet is to that force, the faster it must travel to remain in orbit. Mercury races around the Sun in just 88 days. Earth takes a full year. Mars takes nearly 2. This difference in speed creates natural spacing. Because if planets were closer together, their gravitational interactions would become unstable. Their paths would begin to interfere. Over time, collisions would become inevitable. So the emptiness is not accidental. It is necessary. It is what allows the solar system to remain stable for billions of years. A delicate balance built on distance. But here's the deeper, quieter realization. Even this carefully spaced inner region, which contains all the rocky worlds we might one day visit, is only a tiny fraction of the whole. Because just beyond this, something changes. The distances don't just continue, they expand dramatically. And as we move outward toward the giant planets, the silence between worlds becomes even more profound. The scale begins to stretch in a way that feels almost unreal. And this is where the solar system truly begins to reveal its nature. Not as a collection of planets, but as a vast, mostly empty expanse where worlds are rare and space is the default. In the next part, we'll cross that invisible boundary and enter a region where the scale shifts so dramatically that everything we've felt so far will seem small by comparison. Now let's cross that quiet boundary. Up to this point, everything we've explored still belongs to what we call the inner solar system, a region that, despite its emptiness, still feels somewhat familiar. Rocky worlds, surfaces we can imagine standing on, distances that, while vast, can still be described in ways our minds try to grasp. But as we move outward, something begins to change. The scale does not simply continue, it expands. And the first sign of this shift is Jupiter. If the inner planets felt spaced apart, Jupiter feels distant in a completely different way. It does not sit just a little farther out. It exists in a region that feels almost detached from everything we've just passed. From Earth, Jupiter is not millions of kilometers away, but hundreds of millions. Light, moving at the fastest speed possible, takes over 40 minutes just to travel from the Sun to Jupiter. Compare that to the 8 minutes it takes to reach Earth, and you begin to feel the widening gap. But distance alone is only part of what makes Jupiter so important in this story. Because Jupiter is not just another planet. It is a turning point, a massive presence, so large that it reshapes how the entire solar system behaves. If Earth were a small marble, Jupiter would be something closer to a basketball. Its size is almost difficult to accept, but what matters more is its gravity. Jupiter contains more mass than all the other planets combined. Let that sink in. One world outweighing everything else orbiting the Sun. And because of that, Jupiter acts almost like a boundary, a divider between two different regions of the solar system. Inside its orbit, smaller rocky worlds. Beyond it, something else entirely. But before we move further outward, pause for a moment and consider the space between Mars and Jupiter. This is where we encounter the asteroid belt, the region we briefly touched on earlier. From a distance, it sounds like a bridge, something that fills the gap between inner and outer worlds. But in reality, it fills almost nothing. The asteroid belt spans an enormous region, yet contains very little material. If you could gather everything inside it, all the rocks, all the fragments, all the dust, it would not even form a planet as large as our moon. And yet, this sparse region stretches across hundreds of millions of kilometers. Another vast space barely occupied. Another reminder that emptiness is not the exception here. It is the rule. Now, as we move beyond Jupiter, the scale begins to stretch even further, because the next planet is Saturn. And Saturn is not just a little farther out. It is nearly twice as far from the Sun as Jupiter. Imagine that. You travel from Earth to Jupiter, crossing hundreds of millions of kilometers, and then you must go nearly the same distance again, just to reach the next planet. This is where the solar system begins to feel less like a system and more like a scattering. Saturn itself is immense, surrounded by its delicate rings, but those rings, so wide and beautiful, are incredibly thin. A fragile structure floating in a region dominated by distance. And beyond Saturn, the pattern continues. Uranus, farther still, a world so distant that sunlight there is faint, reduced to a quiet glow. It takes about 84 Earth years for Uranus to complete a single orbit around the Sun. Entire human lifetimes pass, while this distant planet slowly traces its path. And then, Neptune, the outermost major planet, a world so far removed that it feels like the edge of something. Light from the Sun takes about 4 hours to reach Neptune. For hours, traveling at the fastest speed possible, just to cross the space between them. Try to feel that. The warmth of the Sun, the same sunlight that touches your skin, would take hours to arrive there. By the time it does, it is weak, diluted, almost symbolic. And yet, even here, we are still not at the edge. That's the quiet truth. All of this distance, all of this emptiness, all of these worlds scattered across billions of kilometers, and we are still inside the solar system. Now the question from earlier begins to evolve. Not just why things are spaced apart, but why the distances increase so dramatically as we move outward. Why does the solar system stretch like this? Why do the gaps grow wider the farther we go? To answer that, we need to think back, not to how the solar system looks now, but to how it formed. Because the structure we're seeing, this expanding pattern of distance, was not random. It was shaped billions of years ago, during a time when everything was very different. A time when the solar system was not quiet, but chaotic. Not empty, but filled with swirling gas and dust. And in that early chaos, something happened that pushed worlds apart, scattered material outward, and created the vast, silent architecture we see today. We'll explore that soon. But first, we need to go even farther. Because beyond Neptune, beyond the last major planet, lies a region where the solar system begins to dissolve into something even more distant, more diffuse, and far harder to imagine. A place where planets are no longer the focus, where objects drift in darkness, spread across unimaginable distances, and where the true edge of our solar system begins to quietly emerge. Now, let's move beyond Neptune. Not quickly, not all at once, but slowly, allowing the distance to stretch around us as we go. Because crossing Neptune's orbit does not feel like reaching an edge. It feels like leaving something behind. Up to this point, we've been guided by planets' clear markers in the darkness. Even though they were far apart, they gave us structure. A sense that the solar system was organized, almost intentional. But beyond Neptune, that structure begins to fade, and in its place, something quieter emerges. A region known as the Kuiper Belt. At first, it might sound similar to the asteroid belt we passed earlier, just another collection of objects orbiting the Sun. But the scale here is entirely different. The Kuiper Belt does not sit neatly between two planets. It begins at the orbit of Neptune and extends outward for billions of kilometers. Billions. Let that word settle. Not millions, not even hundreds of millions. Billions of kilometers, filled with objects so distant from each other that the concept of a belt becomes almost misleading. Because once again, what defines this region is not what's there, but what isn't. The Kuiper Belt contains countless icy bodies, remnants from the early solar system, fragments that never came together to form a planet. Some are small, just a few kilometers across. Others, like Pluto, are large enough to become worlds in their own right. But even with all these objects, the region is still mostly empty. If you were traveling through it, you would not see a dense field of icy rocks surrounding you. You would see darkness, occasional distant objects, barely visible, separated by vast, quiet gaps. And this is where the feeling begins to change again. Because up to now, emptiness has been something we noticed. Here, it becomes something we feel. The sun, once bright and dominant, is now just another star in the sky, still the brightest, but no longer overwhelming. Its warmth reduced to a faint presence. Time itself seems to stretch out here. Pluto, drifting within this region, takes about 248 Earth years to complete a single orbit. Entire civilizations could rise and fall, while Pluto slowly moves along its path. And even Pluto is not alone. There are thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of similar objects scattered throughout this distant region, each one tracing its own slow orbit, each one separated by distances that would dwarf everything we've experienced so far. And yet, even this is not the edge. That's the part that's easy to miss. Because when we imagine the solar system, we often stop here, at the last visible worlds, at the distant icy objects that feel like a natural boundary. But the solar system does not end with what we can easily observe. Continues, far beyond, into a region so vast, so diffuse, that it becomes almost impossible to picture. A place where objects are no longer grouped in a disk, but spread out in all directions, forming something more like a sphere. This is where we begin to approach the outermost boundary, a distant cloud of icy remnants, stretching tens of thousands of times farther than the distance from Earth to the Sun. But before we go there, pause for a moment and reflect on what we've already seen. From Earth to the Moon, vast emptiness. From planet to planet, expanding gaps. From the inner system to the outer giants, distances growing wider. And now, beyond Neptune, into a region where objects are scattered across billions of kilometers. At every step, the same pattern. Not clustering, not crowding, but separation, which brings us back one final time to that quiet question. Why? Why is the solar system built this way? Why didn't all this material come together into something denser, something more connected? The answer lies not in what we see now, but in what happened long ago. In a time when this entire region was filled with swirling gas and dust, when collisions were constant, when gravity was shaping everything, pulling some material inward and pushing other material far, far away. A time when the giant planets, especially Jupiter, acted like cosmic sculptors, scattering objects outward, preventing them from forming into larger worlds. What we're seeing now is the result of that ancient process. A system that didn't just form, but settled, stabilized, spread out into a structure where distance became necessary and emptiness became permanent. And as we prepare to move even farther outward into the most distant reaches of the solar system, that understanding will begin to deepen. Because what lies ahead is not just distant. It is almost completely beyond human experience. A region where the solar system fades into interstellar space, where the influence of our sun slowly gives way to the gravity of other stars, and where the idea of home becomes something very small in a very large universe. Now, let's take one final step outward, not toward another planet, not toward another familiar object, but toward something far less visible and far more profound. Because beyond the Kuiper Belt, beyond the scattered icy worlds drifting in that distant disk, the solar system does not simply end. It fades, gradually, almost imperceptibly, into something much larger. A region known as the Oort Cloud. But calling it a cloud doesn't quite capture what it truly is. It is not a dense formation, not something you could see surrounding you like mist or fog. It is an enormous spherical distribution of icy objects, extending in every direction, far beyond anything we've explored so far. If the distance from Earth to the Sun is 1 unit, then Neptune sits at about 30 of those units. The Kuiper Belt stretches perhaps to 50, but the Oort Cloud, it begins thousands of times farther out, and may extend up to 100,000 times that original distance. Let that expand slowly in your mind. Everything we've discussed so far, every planet, every asteroid, every icy world, exists in a relatively thin inner region. And then, far beyond, separated by unimaginable distance, lies this vast outer boundary. A boundary that is so distant that light itself takes years to travel across it. Not minutes, not hours, years. At its outer edge, The Oort Cloud may reach nearly halfway to the nearest star, which means something extraordinary. The solar system is not just a collection of planets orbiting a star. It is a structure that extends into interstellar space, blending slowly into the galaxy itself. And within this immense region, there may be trillions of icy objects. Trillions. But even with such an enormous number, the distances between them are so vast that if you were standing on one, you would likely see nothing else around you. No nearby companions, no glowing clusters, just darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. This is the final expression of the pattern we've been following. Emptiness, not as a feature, but as the foundation. From the smallest scales to the largest, the solar system is defined not by what it contains, but by the space between. And yet, there is something quietly beautiful about that, because this emptiness is not meaningless. It is what allows everything to exist in balance. Without these vast distances, orbits would destabilize. Worlds would collide. The delicate gravitational dance that has lasted for billions of years would collapse into chaos. So the silence, the distance, the nothingness, it is not an absence. It is a requirement, a structure built not from matter alone, but from space itself. And as we come to the edge, or something that feels like an edge, another realization begins to form. Everything we've explored, from the warmth of Earth to the frozen reaches of the Oort Cloud, all of it exists within a bubble, a region defined by the influence of our sun. Beyond this, the gravity of other stars begins to take over. The solar system becomes just one small region among countless others, drifting through the galaxy. And that brings us gently back to ourselves, to Earth, because somewhere within all this vastness, within all this emptiness, there is a small world orbiting at just the right distance, in just the right conditions, where something remarkable happened. Life, a fragile, temporary phenomenon, emerging in a place that is surrounded in every direction by silence. And perhaps that is the most profound part of all. Not just how big the solar system is, but how much of it is not us. How much of it is quiet, unchanging, waiting, as if the universe itself is mostly still, with only small pockets of activity scattered within it. And now, as this part of the journey comes to a close, we can finally return to the question we've been carrying. Why is the solar system built like this? Why so much distance, so much separation, so much emptiness? In the next part, we'll go back in time, to the beginning, to the moment when all of this was not empty, but full, when everything was closer, denser, more chaotic. And we'll uncover how that ancient turbulence slowly transformed into the vast, quiet structure we now call home. If you're still here, still drifting through this cosmic silence with me, gently leave a 1 in the comments. Just a small signal in a very large space. And when you're ready, we'll continue. Now, let's go back. Not outward this time, but backward. Back before the distances before the silence, before the solar system became this vast, structured emptiness we've been drifting through. Because there was a time when none of this space existed in the way we see it now. A time when everything was closer, denser, more chaotic, and strangely more connected. Imagine for a moment that instead of planets separated by millions or billions of kilometers, all the material of the solar system existed as a single enormous cloud. Not empty, but filled. A cold, drifting region of gas and dust, stretching across light years, barely visible, yet containing everything that would one day become the sun. The planets, the asteroids, even the distant Oort Cloud. This was the beginning, a quiet cloud suspended in the darkness of the galaxy. And then, something disturbed it. Perhaps a nearby star exploded, sending a shockwave through space. Or maybe the cloud simply became unstable under its own gravity. The exact cause is still uncertain, but what matters is what happened next. The cloud began to collapse, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. But as gravity pulled material inward, the motion increased. Regions became denser, particles moved closer together, collisions became more frequent, and as everything fell inward, something else began to happen. It started to spin, not because something pushed it, but because even the slightest initial motion, when compressed, becomes amplified. Like a figure skater pulling in their arms, the cloud rotated faster and faster as it collapsed. And this spinning changed everything. Instead of collapsing into a simple sphere, the cloud flattened, stretching outward into a rotating disk, with most of the material gathering toward the center. That central region would eventually become the sun. But at this stage, it was not yet a star. It was a growing concentration of gas, becoming hotter and denser as more material fell inward. Around it, the disk continued to spin, and within that disk countless tiny particles of dust began to collide. At first, these collisions were gentle, grains of dust sticking together, forming slightly larger grains, then pebbles, then rocks, then objects large enough that their gravity began to matter. This process, known as accretion, was the beginning of everything we now recognize as planets. But here's the important part. At this stage, there was no emptiness. The disk was filled with material, not evenly, not smoothly, but densely enough that collisions were constant. Everywhere, things were forming, breaking apart, reforming. It was chaotic, violent, unstable, and within that chaos, something unexpected happened. Not everything stayed together. As some regions grew larger, forming the early building blocks of planets, their gravity began to influence everything around them. They pulled material inward, yes, but they also pushed material away, scattering smaller objects, altering their paths, sometimes sending them spiraling inward toward the forming sun, and other times flinging them outward into distant regions. This is where the emptiness begins to take shape, not as something that was always there, but as something that was created, a result of gravitational interactions, of collisions, of massive objects clearing out the space around them. The early planets did not simply form in place. They carved their orbits, sweeping up material, ejecting debris, leaving behind gaps. And those gaps would grow. Over time, as the largest bodies became more dominant, they shaped the structure of the entire system. Jupiter, in particular, played a crucial role. Its immense gravity disrupted the formation of a planet in what is now the asteroid belt, preventing material from coming together, leaving behind a sparse region of scattered fragments. Farther out, the giant planets interacted with each other, shifting their positions, migrating slightly inward or outward, scattering icy objects into the distant reaches of the solar system. Some of those objects were thrown so far that they became part of the Oort Cloud. Others were ejected entirely, lost to interstellar space. What remained slowly settled. Collisions became less frequent. Orbits stabilized. The chaos faded. And in its place emerged something new. A system defined not by density, but by distance, by separation, by vast regions of space, where once there had been constant motion and interaction. And this is the key to understanding everything we've experienced so far. The solar system did not begin empty. It became empty. Not completely, but enough that emptiness now defines it. Every gap between planets, every silent stretch between objects, is the result of billions of years of gravitational sculpting. A slow transformation from a crowded, chaotic beginning into a quiet, stable structure. And yet, even now, traces of that past remain. In the scattered asteroids, in the distant icy bodies of the Kuiper Belt, in the far-reaching Oort Cloud. These are not just objects. They are remnants, fragments of a time when the solar system was full. And as we continue, we'll begin to explore how that ancient chaos didn't just create distance, created order, a delicate balance that has allowed this system to remain stable for billions of years in the vast surrounding silence. As the chaos of the early solar system began to settle, something remarkable emerged. Not randomness, not disorder, but a quiet, almost delicate structure. A balance. And this balance is the reason everything we've explored so far continues to exist without collapsing into destruction. Because if you think back to that early time, when countless objects were forming, colliding, scattering, it might seem surprising that anything stable could come out of it at all. Why didn't the planets crash into each other? Why didn't everything spiral into the sun or drift endlessly into space? The answer lies in something subtle, something that doesn't feel dramatic, but quietly shapes everything. Motion. Every object in the solar system is moving, not randomly, but in a very specific way. They are not falling straight into the sun. They are falling and missing constantly. Imagine throwing a stone forward while gravity pulls it downward. If you throw it gently, it falls quickly to the ground. But if you throw it fast enough, it travels farther before hitting the ground. Now imagine throwing it so fast that as it falls, the ground curves away beneath it, never lands, keeps falling forever. This is what an orbit is, a continuous fall balanced by forward motion. And this balance is what allows planets to exist at stable distances from the Sun. But here's where it becomes even more interesting. Each orbit has its own speed. The closer an object is to the Sun, the faster it must move to maintain that balance. The farther away it is, the slower it travels. This creates a natural spacing, because if two large objects tried to occupy similar orbits, moving at similar distances, their gravitational influence would begin to interfere. Their paths would shift. Over time, they would either collide or push each other apart. So instead, what we see is separation. Each planet settling into its own path, its own region, where it can move without constant disruption. This is why the solar system feels so spread out, because it had to become that way to survive. And over billions of years, this arrangement became more refined. Unstable objects were removed. Some collided and merged. Others were ejected entirely. What remained were the stable orbits we see today. But there's another layer to this balance, something even quieter. Gravity does not just pull objects inward. It also creates relationships between them, subtle connections where one object influences another, even across vast distances. For example, Jupiter. We've already seen how massive it is, how dominant its gravity can be. But its role is even more profound than just shaping the asteroid belt. Jupiter acts almost like a guardian, and at the same time a disruptor. Its gravity captures and redirects objects, sometimes protecting the inner planets from incoming debris, and other times sending objects inward. It creates regions where orbits become unstable, clearing out areas, forming gaps. These gravitational patterns are not random. They are precise resonances where objects fall into repeating relationships with each other. For instance, an asteroid might orbit the Sun twice for every one orbit of Jupiter. Over time, these repeated interactions can either stabilize the asteroid's path or gradually push it away. This is how invisible structures form within the solar system. Not physical walls, not visible barriers, but regions shaped entirely by gravity. And this brings us back, once again, to emptiness. Because many of the empty regions we've passed through are not empty by accident. They are empty because gravity made them that way. Because certain orbits could not remain stable, and anything that entered them was eventually removed. So the solar system, in a quiet, almost invisible way, has been filtering itself, refining itself, shaping itself into a structure where only certain paths, certain distances, can persist, and everything else fades away. But even with all this balance, all this structure, there is still motion. Nothing here is truly still. Planets continue to orbit. Moons continue to circle. Asteroids drift. Comets return again and again, tracing long, distant paths from the outer reaches inward. The solar system is stable, but not static. It is a system in motion, one that has simply reached a state where large-scale chaos has given way to long-term harmony. And yet, if we look closely, we can still see hints of instability. Small changes, gradual shifts, tiny variations that, over immense periods of time, can lead to significant transformations. Because stability, in a system like this, is never absolute. It is temporary, measured not in years or centuries, but in billions of years. And this leads us to another quiet realization. The solar system we see today is not permanent. It is a moment, a long moment, but still just one phase in a much larger story. Because just as it formed from chaos and settled into balance, one day it will change again. But before we look forward, before we explore that distant future, there is one more layer to understand. One more piece of the puzzle that explains why this system, not just any system, became the way it is. Because among all the planets, all the distances, all the emptiness, there is one world that is different. A world that exists in just the right place under just the right conditions, where something rare and fragile was able to begin. And to understand that, we need to return one more time to Earth. Now, let's return, not outward into distance, but inward to something we've quietly carried with us this entire time. Earth, after everything we've seen, the vast emptiness, the scattered worlds, the immense distances that define our solar system, Earth begins to feel different, not because it is large, not because it is central, but because it exists in a place where something unusual happened. Because when the solar system formed, Earth was not guaranteed. There was nothing inevitable about this world. It emerged from the same chaotic process as everything else. The same collisions, the same scattering, the same gravitational shaping that created emptiness. And yet, it ended up here, at just the right distance, in just the right conditions, orbiting in a region we now call the habitable zone, a narrow band around the sun where temperatures allow liquid water to exist. Not too close, where heat would strip everything away. Not too far, where everything would freeze into stillness, but balanced, in between. And that balance is incredibly fragile, because if Earth had formed slightly closer to the sun, it might have become something like Venus, a world trapped in runaway heat, its surface hostile and unrecognizable. If it had formed slightly farther out, it might have resembled Mars, cold, thin, unable to hold on to the atmosphere needed to sustain long-term stability. But Earth remained here, and that alone is only part of the story. Because distance from the sun is not enough to create what we see today. There are other factors, quieter ones, that shaped this world into something capable of supporting life. One of them is size. Earth is large enough to hold onto its atmosphere, to maintain internal heat, to sustain processes beneath its surface. But it is not so large that its gravity becomes overwhelming, trapping gases in a way that would create a thick, crushing environment. It exists in a narrow range where balance is possible. Another factor is movement beneath the surface. The slow shifting of Earth's crust, what we call plate tectonics, allows material to cycle between the surface and the interior. This process regulates temperature over long periods, preventing extreme, permanent conditions from taking hold. Without this, Earth might have become static, unchanging, unable to adapt. And then, there is something even more subtle, the presence of the moon. Earlier, we spoke about the distance between Earth and the moon, how vast that space truly is. But what matters here is not just the distance, but the relationship. The moon stabilizes Earth's tilt. Without it, the angle of Earth's rotation could shift dramatically over time, leading to extreme and unpredictable climate changes. Instead, the tilt remains relatively steady. Seasons come and go, but within a stable range. And over billions of years, that stability matters. It allows long-term processes to unfold. It gives time for complexity to emerge. And beyond all of this, there is one more invisible shield. Earth's magnetic field, generated deep within its core. This field extends outward, protecting the planet from the constant stream of charged particles flowing from the sun. Without it, the atmosphere would slowly erode, stripped away over time as happened on Mars. So when we look at Earth, we are not just looking at a planet. We are looking at a combination of conditions, each one quietly aligned, each one contributing to a balance that is rare. And this is where the scale of the solar system becomes even more meaningful. Because all that emptiness we've explored, all that distance, all that separation, it isolates Earth, protects it. It creates a buffer, a region of stability, where catastrophic interactions are less frequent, where gravitational disruptions are minimized. In a strange way, the emptiness is part of the reason Earth can exist as it does. The silence becomes a kind of shelter, and yet, this realization carries something deeper. Because if Earth is the result of such precise conditions, within such a vast and mostly empty system, then what we have here may not be common. It may not be repeated often. Across all the distances we've traveled, across all the worlds we've passed, we have not seen another place quite like this. And that raises another quiet question. Is Earth rare, or are there others, hidden somewhere in the vastness, orbiting distant stars, separated by distances even greater than anything we've imagined tonight? We don't yet know, but what we do know is this. Our solar system, for all its size, for all its emptiness, contains at least one world where something extraordinary happened. And that world exists in a delicate balance shaped by everything around it. By distance, by motion, by gravity, by time. And as we continue, we'll begin to look forward. Beyond the present, beyond the structure we see now. Because just as the solar system formed and settled into this quiet balance, it will not remain this way forever. Change is still coming, slowly, inevitably, and when it does, even this stable, familiar system will begin to transform once again. Now, let's look forward. Not quickly, not with urgency, but in the same slow, quiet way we've moved through everything so far. Because the future of the solar system is not something that happens suddenly. It unfolds, gradually, over timescales so vast that even millions of years feel like brief moments. Right now, everything feels stable. The planets follow their paths. The distances remain consistent. The balance we've explored seems almost permanent. But it isn't. It only feels that way because human lifetimes are so short compared to cosmic time. If we could watch the solar system over millions or billions of years, we would begin to notice subtle changes. Tiny shifts in orbits, small gravitational interactions, slowly adding up. At first, these changes are almost invisible, but over long periods, they accumulate. For example, the moon. Earlier, we spoke about how it stabilizes Earth's tilt, how it quietly supports the conditions that allow life to exist. But the moon is not fixed in place. It is drifting away, very slowly, at a rate of just a few centimeters per year. Too small to notice in a lifetime, but over millions of years, that distance grows. And as it does, its influence on Earth changes. The tides weaken, the stabilizing effect shifts. Nothing dramatic, not at first, but enough to remind us that even familiar relationships are not permanent. And this is happening everywhere. Planets, though stable, are not perfectly fixed. Their orbits can shift slightly over time, influenced by the gravity of other planets. These interactions are subtle, but persistent, like a quiet conversation happening continuously across millions of kilometers. Most of the time, this system remains stable, but over extremely long timescales, these small variations can lead to larger effects. Not necessarily chaos, but change. Gradual, inevitable change. And beyond these internal shifts, there is something even larger, something that will eventually reshape everything. The sun itself. Right now, it feels constant, a steady source of light and warmth, unchanged from day to day. But like everything else, it is evolving, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The sun is becoming brighter. Over hundreds of millions of years, the amount of energy it releases increases. And that has consequences. Earth, sitting in the habitable zone, begins to warm. Not dramatically at first, but steadily. Oceans begin to evaporate. Atmospheric conditions shift. The balance that allowed life to thrive begins to fade. This is not something that happens tomorrow or even in the near future, but it is part of the long-term story, a reminder that even the most stable conditions are temporary. And then a much farther ahead, billions of years from now, something far more dramatic occurs. The sun begins to change more rapidly. It runs out of the hydrogen fuel that has powered it for billions of years and begins a new phase of its life. It expands, slowly at first, then more dramatically, growing into what is known as a red giant. Its outer layers stretch outward, reaching farther and farther into space. Mercury, gone. Venus, consumed. And Earth's fate is uncertain in detail, but clear in outcome. Even if it is not fully engulfed, it will be transformed beyond recognition. The oceans long gone, the surface scorched, the atmosphere stripped away. What was once a living world becomes silent. And beyond Earth, the outer planets feel this change as well. Their environments shift. Icy regions warm. Distant worlds experience new conditions, temporary but significant. The entire structure of the solar system begins to transform. And then, after this phase, the sun sheds its outer layers, releasing them into space, forming a glowing shell of gas. What remains is a dense core, a white dwarf, small, hot, slowly cooling over time. At this point, the solar system is no longer what it once was. The central force that held everything together is weaker. Orbits expand. Distances increase even further. Some objects may drift away, no longer bound as tightly as before. The system begins to loosen, and over even longer timescales, trillions of years, everything continues to fade. The white dwarf cools, light diminishes, motion slows. The solar system becomes quieter, darker, more diffuse. But even then, it does not completely disappear, because the structure, the distances, the relationships we've explored leave a lasting imprint, a pattern that once emerged from chaos and persisted for billions of years. And as we consider this future, something subtle begins to settle in. All the vastness we've traveled through, all the emptiness, all the distance, all the quiet balance, it is not static. It is part of a long, evolving story, one that began in chaos, found stability, and will eventually change again. And in the next part, will gently bring everything together, not by adding more distance, but by reflecting on what all of this means, what it feels like to exist inside a system so vast, so quiet, so overwhelmingly empty, and what that says about our place within it. Now, let everything slow down. We've traveled outward, across distances so vast they begin to feel abstract. We've gone backward, to a time when everything was dense and chaotic. And we've looked forward into a future where even the sun will change, and the structure we know will gradually fade. But now we pause, because there is something deeper, something quieter, that sits beneath all of this. Not just what the solar system is, but what it feels like. Because when you step back, when you hold all of this in your mind at once, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a visual pattern, but an emotional one. The solar system is mostly empty. That is the truth we've been slowly uncovering. Not just empty in certain regions, but overwhelmingly empty at every scale. Between Earth and the Moon, between the planets, beyond Neptune, out to the distant edges of the Oort Cloud. Again and again, the same idea. Space dominates, and yet, within that vast emptiness, there are small islands. worlds, moments, places where something happens. Earth is one of those places, a small, fragile point surrounded in every direction by silence. And this creates a kind of contrast, because everything we experience, everything we know exists within a very thin layer of activity, inside an enormous quiet structure. It's like being in a single room, inside a building the size of a planet. All the sound, all the motion, all the meaning is concentrated in one place. And beyond it, stillness. But here's what makes this even more profound. This pattern is not unique to the solar system. Continues beyond. The space between stars is even more empty. The space between galaxies more vast still. The universe itself follows the same structure. Not dense, not crowded, but mostly nothing with small pockets of something. And yet, from that something, everything we know emerges. Planets, oceans, life, thought, you, right now, listening. And this is where the scale begins to shift again. Not physically, but in perspective. Because earlier, the emptiness may have felt unsettling. Too large, too quiet, too disconnected. But now, it can begin to feel different. Because that emptiness is what allows structure to exist. It is what allows orbits to remain stable. It is what prevents constant collisions. It is what creates the conditions for long-term balance. Without it, everything would collapse into chaos. So the silence is not a flaw. It is a feature, a necessary part of the system, a quiet framework within which everything else can unfold. And within that framework, there is time. Time for stars to burn. Time for planets to form. Time for life to emerge, evolve, and become aware of itself. Time for you to sit here and imagine all of this. And as that thought settles, something gentle begins to happen. The vastness no longer feels overwhelming, feels spacious, open, almost calm, because nothing is rushing, nothing is crowded. Everything moves slowly, predictably, quietly. The solar system is not a place of constant activity. It is a place of long, slow motion, unfolding over billions of years. And within that slow motion, there is a kind of peace, a stillness that surrounds everything. Even Earth, for all its activity, exists within that stillness, orbiting quietly through space year after year. And if you imagine stepping outside of it, far enough away, everything becomes even quieter. No sound, no urgency, just motion and distance and time. And this brings us gently to the end of this part of the journey. Not an ending in the usual sense, but a transition, because in the final part, we won't be adding new distances or new structures. We'll simply let everything settle. We'll bring together everything we've felt, everything we've understood, and allow it to slow down, to become softer, quieter, more reflective, like drifting at the edge of the solar system, looking back, not with urgency, but with calm awareness. If you're still here, still listening, gently drifting through this vast, quiet space. Leave a 2 in the comments. Just a small signal in a universe that doesn't need many. And when you're ready, we'll move into the final part and let the journey come to rest. Now we slow down. No more rushing outward. No more tracing distances from planet to planet. No more expanding scales that stretch beyond imagination. Instead, we simply drift, as if we've reached the outer edge of the solar system and turned around just to look back. From here, everything feels different. The sun, once overwhelming, is now just a bright point in the distance. Still powerful, still central, but no longer dominant in your field of view. And somewhere around it, too small to see, too far to distinguish, are the planets. All of them, everything we've explored, reduced to a tiny structure floating in an immense darkness. And from this distance, something becomes clear. The solar system is not large because of what it contains. It is large because of what it does not. The planets themselves, if placed side by side, would occupy only a small fraction of the space we've traveled through. Even Jupiter, the giant, is insignificant compared to the distances that separate it from everything else. The sun, holding almost all the mass, still occupies only a tiny region compared to the vast bubble of influence surrounding it. So what we are really looking at is not a collection of objects, but a structure defined by absence. A framework made of space itself. And this realization begins to soften everything, because earlier that emptiness may have felt unsettling, too quiet, too disconnected, but now, from this distance, it begins to feel almost intentional, as if the solar system is not crowded, not chaotic, but carefully spaced. Each object given room to exist, room to move, room to remain stable for billions of years. And in that spacing, there is something calming. Nothing is pressing against anything else. Nothing is on the verge of collision. Everything follows its path, slowly, predictably, in a kind of silent harmony. And if you stay here, just for a moment, letting that image settle, you begin to notice something else. The solar system is not isolated. It is moving. The entire structure, this vast bubble of space and motion, is drifting through the galaxy, carried along, orbiting the center of the Milky Way, surrounded by other stars, other systems, each with their own quiet structures, their own patterns of emptiness and motion. And yet, even here, even surrounded by billions of stars, the distances remain vast. Stars are not crowded together. They too are separated by enormous gaps. So the pattern continues. From planets to stars to galaxies, separation, space, silence. And within that silence, small regions of activity. Small islands where something happens, where matter gathers, where light shines, where time unfolds in ways we can perceive. And we exist in one of those islands, on a small world orbiting a single star, inside a system that is mostly empty. And that perspective changes something, because it shifts the focus. away from size and toward rarity. Not how big the solar system is, but how unusual it is that within it something like Earth exists. A place where the silence is broken, where chemistry became biology, where awareness emerged from matter that once drifted through a collapsing cloud billions of years ago. And now, that awareness is here, listening, thinking, imagining the very system that created it. And that is a quiet kind of loop. The solar system understanding itself through you. And as that thought settles, everything becomes just a little softer, a little slower, because there is no urgency here, no need to rush. The solar system will continue orbiting, evolving, changing long after this moment. And right now, you are simply observing it, drifting through it, feeling its scale, not as numbers, but as space, as distance, as calm. And from here, we can begin to let go of the need to measure it. We don't need to calculate distances anymore. We don't need to compare sizes. We can simply experience it as a vast, quiet structure floating in an even larger universe. And as we continue, we'll let that feeling deepen. Let everything become even slower, even quieter, as the journey begins to gently come to rest. Stay here, just a little longer. No need to move forward yet, because from this distant vantage point, something subtle begins to happen to your sense of scale. At first, everything we explored felt impossibly large. Distances stretched beyond intuition. Numbers lost meaning. The solar system felt overwhelming, almost too vast to hold in your mind. But now, after traveling through it, after slowly experiencing each layer of distance, something changes. It begins to feel simple, not small, but understandable. Because when you remove the expectation that things should be close, when you accept that space is mostly empty, the structure of the solar system becomes almost elegant. A central star, a few scattered worlds, and vast regions of quiet space in between. Nothing excessive, nothing crowded, just enough. And that simplicity is calming, because it mirrors something deeper, something that exists beyond astronomy. Pattern of balance, where things are not packed together, not overwhelming, but spaced in a way that allows them to exist without interference. And if you let your attention soften, you can almost feel that balance. Each planet following its path. Each orbit steady and uninterrupted. Each region defined not by activity, but by stillness. Even the motion feels quiet. There are no sounds in space, no rushing wind, no echoes, just movement happening silently across unimaginable distances. And within that silence, time stretches. A single orbit of Neptune takes longer than a human lifetime. Pluto drifts so slowly that entire generations pass before it completes its path. Even the sun, though it feels constant, is changing at a pace so slow, it seems eternal. Everything here exists on a timescale that is patient, unhurried, And when you begin to align with that pace, your perception shifts again. Because the solar system is no longer something you are trying to comprehend quickly. It becomes something you can simply rest within. A vast, quiet environment where nothing demands immediate attention. And this is where the emptiness reveals its final quality. Not just space, not just distance, but silence as a kind of comfort. Because in a crowded system, everything would compete. Gravitational forces would constantly disrupt one another. Paths would shift. Collisions would be frequent. But here, there is room. Room for stability. Room for continuity. Room for time to pass without sudden change. And within that room, everything can unfold slowly, predictably, almost peacefully. Even the journeys we imagined earlier, traveling from one planet to another, taking months or years, begin to feel less like obstacles and more like part of the rhythm. Because nothing here is meant to be fast. The solar system is not designed for urgency. It is designed for duration, for persistence, for existence over billions of years. And in that sense, it becomes something you don't need to conquer or cross or fully measure. It becomes something you can simply observe, like watching waves move across a vast ocean, except the waves take centuries, and the ocean spans billions of kilometers. And somewhere within that ocean is Earth, still orbiting, still moving, still carrying life through this immense quiet. And if you imagine zooming back in, just slightly, not all the way, but enough to sense it again, you can picture that small world, turning slowly, half in light, half in darkness. Clouds drifting, oceans shifting, life continuing, all of it contained within a tiny region, surrounded by endless space. And that contrast becomes gentle now, not overwhelming, not unsettling, just present. A reminder that even within vast emptiness, there can be meaning. There can be activity, there can be awareness, and as you hold that image, the solar system no longer feels like something distant. It feels like a quiet home, not because it is small, but because you understand it. You've moved through its scale, not as numbers, but as experience. And now, there's nothing left to figure out, nothing left to calculate, only something to feel. And as we continue, we'll let that feeling deepen even further, slowing everything down, just a little more, until the journey becomes almost still. Now, let everything become even softer. No need to hold on to structure anymore. No need to trace distances or follow orbits. Just remain here in this quiet perspective where the solar system is no longer something to analyze, but something to gently experience. Because when you step far enough away, something interesting happens. Details fade. The differences between planets, their sizes, their compositions, their histories, all of that begins to blur. And what remains is only the pattern, a central light, and around it motion, slow, continuous, silent motion. The planets are no longer separate worlds in your mind. They become points drifting along invisible paths. Their individuality dissolves, not because it's unimportant, but because at this scale, everything simplifies. And simplicity is calming, because it removes the need to focus. There is nothing here demanding attention, nothing pulling you in different directions, just a steady, predictable rhythm. The sun radiating outward, the planets circling, the entire system drifting through the galaxy. And beyond that, more space, always more space. It's almost as if the solar system exists within layers of quiet. The space between planets, quiet. The space between stars, even quieter. The space between galaxies, quieter still. Each layer expanding outward, reducing activity, softening motion, until everything becomes almost still. And yet, nothing has actually stopped. Everything continues, but at a pace so slow, so vast, that it feels like stillness. This is the nature of cosmic time. It doesn't rush. It doesn't push. It simply unfolds. And when you align with that pace, even briefly, something inside you begins to slow as well. Because there is no urgency here, no deadlines, no sudden changes, just long, gradual motion unfolding over billions of years. And in that kind of environment, tension has nothing to hold on to. It dissolves. There is simply too much space for anything to feel compressed. And that brings us to a quiet realization. The solar system, for all its size, is not overwhelming when experienced like this. It becomes gentle, spacious, almost peaceful, because you are no longer trying to grasp it all at once. You are simply letting it exist around you, like floating in a calm ocean where the water stretches endlessly in every direction, but remains smooth, undisturbed. And somewhere within that calm, there is Earth, still there, still turning, still holding everything familiar. But from here, it is just another part of the pattern, not central, not dominant, just one point among many. And strangely, that does not make it feel less important. It makes it feel more delicate, more precious, because within all this vastness, within all this quiet, that small point is where everything you know exists. Every sound, every memory, every moment, all contained within something so small compared to the space around it. And yet, it is enough, because meaning does not come from size. It comes from experience, from awareness, from the simple fact that something exists to notice it. And right now, that something is you, listening, imagining, drifting through the scale, not physically, but mentally, allowing your perspective to expand and then gently settle. And as it settles, the need to understand everything begins to fade, because understanding is no longer the goal. Presence is just being here within this idea, within this quiet structure, within this vast, mostly empty system, and letting it be what it is. No more questions, no more comparisons, just space, just motion, just time. And as we move toward the final moments of this journey, everything will slow even further, not adding anything new, but simply allowing everything we've felt to rest, to become still, to gently fade into a calm, quiet awareness, like drifting at the edge of space with nothing left to reach for. Now, let everything drift even further into stillness. There is nothing left to explore, no more distances to measure, no more structures to understand, only a quiet awareness of where you are, floating somewhere at the edge of it all. The solar system behind you, vast, silent, slowly turning. The sun, now just a distant glow. The planets, invisible from here, yet still moving, still tracing their paths, exactly as they have for billions of years. And beyond you, more space, always more space, no boundary, no edge you can truly reach, just a gradual fading from one region into another, until even the idea of inside and outside begins to lose meaning. And in that kind of space, something subtle happens. Your sense of scale dissolves, because there is nothing to compare against anymore. No nearby objects, no familiar distances, just openness, endless, quiet openness. And instead of feeling overwhelming, it begins to feel light, because there is nothing pressing in, nothing surrounding you, only space in every direction. And if you let yourself settle into that feeling, even for a moment, it becomes almost peaceful, like floating in a place where nothing is required of you. No movement, no effort, just presence. And somewhere far behind is everything. Every planet we visited, every distance we tried to imagine, every explanation, every question, every answer. All of it contained within a small region now reduced to a memory. And what remains is the feeling, the quiet understanding that the solar system is not crowded and not chaotic, not overwhelming, but spacious, balanced, silent, a structure built not from constant activity, but from distance. And in that distance, there is room for motion, room for time, room for things to exist without interference. And as you stay here just a little longer, you might begin to notice something else. The absence of sound. Not silence as we know it. Not the quiet of a room at night, but a deeper kind of silence. A silence that has always been there. Because space does not carry sound. There are no vibrations moving through air. No echoes. No background noise. Just stillness. And within that stillness, everything unfolds. Stars burn. Planets orbit. Galaxies drift. All without a single sound. And somehow, that makes it feel even calmer. Because nothing is rushing. Nothing is calling for attention. Everything simply exists. And in that existence, there is a rhythm. Not a fast one. Not something you can count. But a slow, continuous unfolding that never stops. And you are part of it. Not separate. Not outside. But within. On a small world orbiting quietly inside this vast, open system. And even though that world feels distant from here, it is still connected. still moving, still part of the same structure. And so are you, right now, listening, breathing, thinking, all of it happening within this immense silent framework. And that connection is enough. There is nothing you need to do with it, nothing you need to change, just something to notice, gently, without effort. And as we move toward the final moments, everything begins to slow even more, not because anything is stopping, but because your awareness is settling, becoming quieter, softer, less focused on details, and more on the feeling of space itself. And in that feeling, there is no urgency, no pressure, only time, endless time, stretching outward, just like the distances we've traveled. And as that time unfolds, the solar system continues exactly as it always has, turning, drifting, existing, quietly. Now, there is nothing left to reach for, no more distances to travel, no more questions waiting ahead, no more edges to cross. Only this moment, this quiet awareness floating gently within everything we've explored. The solar system, no longer something distant or abstract, but something you've slowly moved through layer by layer until it became familiar. Not small, not simple, but understood in a way that doesn't require numbers, only feeling. And as you rest here, at the edge of it all, you can sense it one last time. The vastness, the space between worlds, the silence that fills everything. But now it no longer feels empty, feels open, like a calm, endless horizon, stretching in every direction, without pressure, without urgency. And somewhere within that horizon is the sun, still glowing, still radiating light, quietly, steadily, just as it has for billions of years. And around it, the planets continue their motion, Earth still turning, still carrying oceans, clouds of life, across the same path it has followed for so long. Nothing has changed, and yet something has, because now you've seen it differently. You've felt the distances not as numbers, but as silence. You've understood the emptiness not as absence, but as structure. You've followed the journey from a dense, chaotic beginning to a vast, balanced system where everything has its place and everything has room. And in that understanding, there is a kind of calm, because the solar system does not demand anything from you. It does not rush. It does not overwhelm. It simply exists, slowly, patiently, quietly, and you, for a brief moment, have drifted through it, not physically, but in thought, in imagination, in awareness. And now, there is nothing left to hold on to, only the feeling, a gentle sense of space, of distance, of stillness, as if you are floating, not moving, not falling, just existing within something vast and quiet and calm. And as that feeling settles, everything begins to soften. The idea of planets fades. The idea of distance fades. Even the idea of the solar system itself becomes less defined, until all that remains is space. Endless, silent, open space, and within it, a small point, not bright, not loud, just present. And that point is enough, because within that small presence, everything you know exists. Every thought, every memory, every moment, all contained within something so small compared to everything around it. And yet, it matters, not because of its size, but because it is experienced, because it is felt, because it is alive with awareness. And as you rest here, just a little longer, you can let that awareness drift. No need to focus, no need to follow anything. Just allow your thoughts to slow, your attention to soften, your sense of scale to dissolve into something gentle. Because the universe is not in a hurry. The solar system will continue. The stars will continue. Everything will keep unfolding, whether you watch it or not. And right now, you don't need to follow it anymore. You can simply rest in the quiet, in the space, in the slow, steady motion that never truly stops, but never needs to rush. And as this journey comes to its natural end, there is only one small thing left to do. If you're still here, still drifting in this calm, quiet space, gently leave a 3 in the comments. A soft signal from one small point in a vast silent system. And then let everything fade. Let the solar system drift away into the distance. Let the stars soften. Let the darkness become calm, and rest in the quiet that remains.